1940. The fate of the free world hangs by a thread. That thread is not made of gold or silk. It is made of aluminum, rubber, and high-octane gasoline. It is spun in the cold air 4 miles above the English Channel. If you were a betting man in the summer of 1940, you wouldn't bet on Britain. The German war machine had swallowed Europe whole in weeks. Poland, Norway, France, the greatest armies on the continent had crumbled before the Blitzkrieg, and at the tip of that spear was a fighter plane that seemed invincible, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. It was faster than anything the Allies had. It climbed like a rocket. It was flown by veterans who had been killing since the Spanish Civil War. Against them stood a frantic, disorganized island defense, and a plane that looked less like a weapon and more like a work of art, the Supermarine Spitfire. For the next few months, these two machines would dance a deadly waltz. But to understand why this duel mattered, to truly understand why the Spitfire and the 109 were destined to meet, we have to go back, before the guns, before the bombs, before the hate. We have to go back to a race. September 1931, the Solent, England, the Schneider Trophy. It was the Formula One of its day, but faster and infinitely more dangerous. Nations didn't race cars, they raced seaplanes. And the goal wasn't just a trophy, it was national supremacy. Standing on the dock, watching his creation scream past at 340 miles per hour, was a quiet, intense man named Reginald Mitchell. Mitchell was not a soldier. He was a designer for Supermarine, a company known for building slow, lumbering flying boats. But Mitchell was obsessed with speed. He hated drag the way a doctor hates disease. His creation, the S6B, won the trophy that day. It set a world speed record. Britain was the fastest nation on Earth. But Mitchell wasn't celebrating. He was dying. In 1933, at the height of his career, Mitchell was diagnosed with rectal cancer. The surgery was brutal. The colostomy bag was a permanent humiliation. The doctors told him to retire, to rest, to enjoy his final months. Mitchell ignored them. He had visited Germany. He had seen what was happening. He heard the speeches. He saw the factories. He knew that racing seaplanes wouldn't stop what was coming. Britain needed a fighter. The Air Ministry issued specification F730. They wanted a new fighter. Mitchell's first attempt was ugly. The Type 224, cranked wings, fixed landing gear. It was a failure. Mitchell was furious. He went back to the drawing board, literally. He decided to ignore the ministry's conservative rules. He would build the plane he wanted to build. He took the sleek fuselage of his racing seaplane. He stripped off the floats. He installed the most powerful engine available, the Rolls-Royce PV-12, later known as the Merlin. And then he designed the wing. This is important. If you remember nothing else about the Spitfire, remember the wing. Mitchell chose an elliptical planform, not because it was pretty, but because of the physics. An elliptical wing distributes lift perfectly across the entire span. This minimizes induced drag, the aerodynamic resistance created when you generate lift. It meant the wing could be very thin, making it fast, but also very large, making it maneuverable. It was a masterstroke of engineering genius. It was also a manufacturing nightmare. The curves were compound. You couldn't just stamp them out. They had to be rolled and beaten by hand. The leading edge was a complex D-box structure. The spars were telescopic. Building a Spitfire was like building a Swiss watch the size of a truck. But Mitchell didn't care about cost. He didn't care about ease of production. He was building a legacy. Meanwhile, in Augsburg, Germany, another man was staring at a blank sheet of paper. Willy Messerschmitt. Unlike the artistic Mitchell, Messerschmitt was a pragmatist, a cold, calculating modernist. He didn't want to build a work of art, he wanted to build a weapon. And he had a chip on his shoulder. The German aviation establishment hated him. Erhard Milch, the State Secretary of Aviation, personally blamed Messerschmitt for a crash that killed his friend. Messerschmitt was forbidden from building fighters. But like Mitchell, Messerschmitt ignored the rules. When the Luftwaffe announced a competition for a new fighter in 1934, Messerschmitt worked in secret. His philosophy was radical: the smallest possible airframe wrapped around the most powerful possible engine. Look at the Bf 109. It's tiny. It's cramped. While the Spitfire was curves, the 109 was angles. The wings were trapezoidal. Straight lines, easy to cut, easy to mass produce. Messerschmitt put the entire structural load on the fuselage. He attached the landing gear to the body, not the wings. Why? So that ground crews could detach the wings for transport or repair without the plane falling over. It was brilliant logistics. It meant you could build them fast, fix them fast, and ship them anywhere by train. This was the fundamental clash. Mitchell built a plane for the pilot. Messerschmitt built a plane for the war. One was designed to fly beautifully. The other was designed to be built by the thousands.
March 5, 1936. Reginald Mitchell, pale and weak, watched as the prototype K-5054 taxied out. The test pilot, Mutt Summers, took off. 8 minutes later, he landed and famously said, "I don't want anything touched." It was perfect. But tragedy was waiting in the wings. Mitchell died in June 1937 at the age of 42. He never saw his creation go to war. He never saw the Battle of Britain. Before he died, he reportedly said of the name Spitfire, "It's just the sort of bloody, silly name they would choose." He was gone, but his machine was ready. While the British were still testing, the Germans were already killing. Spain, 1937, the Condor Legion. Hitler sent his new Luftwaffe to support General Franco. It was the perfect testing ground. The Bf 109 entered combat. It slaughtered the Soviet-built Polikarpovs of the Republicans. German pilots like Werner Molders weren't just flying, they were writing the textbook on modern air combat. They realized that tight, parade ground formations were suicide. They developed the finger four formation, loose, flexible, deadly. They learned that speed was life. They learned that altitude was insurance. By 1939, the German pilots were the most experienced in the world. Their machine, the 109, had been blooded in battle. The Spitfire, it was still a virgin, untested, unproven. September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland. World War II begins. For the first few months, the phony war, the two champions didn't meet. They circled each other like boxers in the first round. The 109 swept through Poland and France, building a reputation of invincibility. It was called the Yellow-Nosed Bastard by terrified enemies. The British public looked to the sky and whispered the name Spitfire like a prayer. But the RAF held them back. They were saving them for the defense of the homeland. Dunkirk, May 1940. This was the first clash. Desperate to cover the retreating army, the RAF finally unleashed the Spitfire. For the first time, 109 pilots looked in their mirrors and saw something that could keep up with them. For the first time, the hunter became the hunted. A German pilot later wrote, "It was a shock. We were told the British had nothing. Suddenly there were these ellipses, these beautiful, deadly shapes. The stage was set. The channel was the arena. The engineering duel was about to become a fight for survival. And both sides had a fatal flaw that they were about to discover the hard way."
If the airframe is the body, the engine is the soul. And in 1940, the soul of the British resistance was a 27-liter V-12 beast called the Merlin. Designed by Rolls-Royce, it was a marvel of mechanical complexity. Over 14,000 parts moving in perfect harmony at 3,000 revolutions per minute. Listen to that sound. Veterans will tell you that a Merlin doesn't just make noise, it sings. It has a distinctive, high-pitched whine caused by the supercharger spinning at 28,000 RPM. To the people of London hiding in bomb shelters, that sound was the only thing promising them they would see the morning. The German heart was darker. The Daimler-Benz DB601. Like the Merlin, it was a V12. Like the Merlin, it produced around 1,100 horsepower in 1940. But look closer. It's upside down. The Germans inverted the V-shape. The cylinders point towards the ground. Why? Visibility. By putting the heavy crankshaft at the top, they could slope the nose of the aircraft down, giving the pilot a better view of his target. It also lowered the center of gravity. It was a smart, tactical design choice. On paper, the two engines were evenly matched. In a straight line, top speeds were almost identical, around 350 to 360 miles per hour. But the DB601 had a secret weapon hidden inside its cylinders, a secret that would lead to one of the most terrifying phrases in the RAF pilot's vocabulary: engine cut. Imagine the scene. You are in a Spitfire. You are on the tail of a 109. You have him in your sights. Suddenly, the German pilot pushes his stick forward, hard. He bunts into a steep, high-speed dive towards the ground. Negative G-force kicks in. You instinctively push your stick forward to follow him. Silence. Your engine dies. Why? Because the Rolls-Royce Merlin used a carburetor. It relied on a float to regulate fuel, just like a toilet cistern. When you push the nose down, negative gravity lifts that float. The fuel supply is cut off. The engine starves. For 3 agonizing seconds, you are not flying a fighter plane. You are falling in a 7-ton glider. The German pilot, thanks to his fuel injection system, suffers no such problem. Pumps force the fuel into the engine regardless of gravity. He dives away laughing. By the time your engine coughs back to life, he is gone. This wasn't just an annoyance. It was a fatal flaw. British pilots had to learn a bizarre maneuver: roll the aircraft upside down first, then pull back on the stick to dive, just to keep positive G's on the carburetor. It was clumsy. It wasted time. And in a dogfight, time is the only currency that matters. The British eventually fixed it with a stopgap solution called Miss Schilling's orifice, a simple restrictor washer invented by a female engineer, Beatrice Schilling. But in the summer of 1940, that cutout killed many good men.
If you can catch the enemy, you still have to kill him. And here, the British and German engineers stood on opposite sides of a deep philosophical divide. The Spitfire was a shotgun.
It carried 8 Browning 303 machine guns, 4 in each wing. The British theory was based on pre-war calculations. Pilots wouldn't be able to aim precisely at high speeds, so you need volume. You need a cone of fire. When a Spitfire pilot pressed the firing button, he unleashed a storm. 1,200 rounds per minute, 160 bullets leaving the plane every single second. It sounds impressive. It looked terrifying. But there was a problem. The bullets were small, rifle caliber. Against a metal-skinned Messerschmitt, they were like throwing pebbles at a tank. Pilots reported emptying their entire ammunition drums into a German bomber only to watch it fly home. Unless you hit the pilot or the fuel tank, the .303 just didn't have the kinetic energy to tear metal apart. You had to get close, dangerously close, 250 yards or less. The Germans chose a different path, the path of the sniper. The Bf 109E carried 2 machine guns on the nose, but its real power lay in the wings, 2 MGFF 20mm cannons. Later models would mount a cannon firing right through the propeller hub. These weren't shooting bullets, they were shooting grenades. The Germans developed Mingenschoss, mine shells, thin-walled shells packed with high explosives. They didn't rely on kinetic energy to punch a hole. They relied on chemical energy to blow the structure apart. British analysis showed that it took roughly 400 hits from a .303 to destroy a bomber. It took only 4 hits from a 20mm cannon to do the same job. And for a Spitfire, 1 single cannon shell to the fuselage could cut the tail off. As German ace Adolf Galland said, "1 burst, that's all you need. You don't graze them, you erase them." But the cannon had a drawback. It had a low muzzle velocity. The shells dropped rapidly, like throwing a rock. Aiming required immense skill. So the duel was set. The British pilot had to spray and pray, getting close enough to smell the exhaust of his enemy. The German pilot had to calculate a complex ballistic arc, but knowing if he connected, it was game over. Let's step inside the office. Where did these young men spend the most terrifying hours of their lives? The Spitfire cockpit was tight. If you were claustrophobic, you were in the wrong job. Your shoulders practically brushed the sides of the fuselage. But it fit like a glove. The controls were perfectly balanced. Pilots said, "You didn't fly a Spitfire, you wore it." You just thought about turning, and the plane turned. But it had issues. The early canopies were flat-sided. You couldn't see behind you easily. And in 1940, if you couldn't check your 6, you were dead. Later, they added the Malcolm hood, a bulged canopy that allowed pilots to lean out and look back. A small change that saved hundreds of lives. The 109 was different. If the Spitfire was a sports car, the 109 was a coffin. The canopy was heavily framed, obstructing the view. The seating position was reclined, legs raised high, a design to help pilots handle G-forces, but extremely uncomfortable for long patrols. It was cramped, hot, and smelled of gasoline and oil. But it felt safe. Messerschmitt protected his pilots. The armor plating behind the seat was substantial. The fuel tank was behind the pilot, not in front, like the Spitfire initially. But the 109 had heavy controls. At high speeds, above 400 miles per hour, the ailerons became stiff. It was like wrestling a bear. While a Spitfire could roll and turn effortlessly at high speed, a 109 pilot had to use both hands and all his strength just to bank the aircraft. This dictated the tactics. If you're in a Spitfire, you turn. You use your maneuverability to get inside the Germans' turn radius. If you're in a 109, you don't turn. You climb, you dive, you use your vertical performance. You strike like a hawk and vanish back into the sun. Boom and zoom versus turn and burn. Two different planes, two different philosophies. But engineering is only half the story. The other half is the invisible war.
While Mitchell and Messerschmitt were fighting with aluminum and horsepower, the British were secretly building a weapon that had no propeller, no guns, no wings. It was called RDF, Range and Direction Finding. We know it today as radar. The Germans had radar too. Their technology was arguably better, but they used it as a gadget. The British used it as a system, the Dowding system. Every radar tower was connected by telephone lines to a central nervous system. Information flowed from the coast to the filter room, then to the group headquarters, then to the airfields. Within minutes of a German takeoff in France, a telephone would ring in a Spitfire dispersal hut in Kent. For the Luftwaffe pilots, it was a psychological nightmare. They would fly across the channel, thinking they were undetected. The sky would be empty. Then, exactly when they were most vulnerable, low on fuel, escorting slow bombers, the Spitfires would appear out of nowhere. They called them the bastards from the clouds. They started to believe the British were psychic. They weren't psychic. They were just well informed. Without radar, the Spitfire would have been useless. You can have the best fighter in the world, but if it's on the ground refueling when the enemy arrives, it's just a target. Radar allowed the RAF to keep their planes on the ground until the very last second. It multiplied their force. One Spitfire with radar was worth 10 without it. By late August 1940, despite the radar, the Spitfire was losing. The Luftwaffe was relentlessly pounding the airfields. Manston, Biggin Hill, Kenley. The ground crews were dying. The runways were cratered. Communications were cut. The RAF was hours away from collapse. And then a mistake changed history. On the night of August 24th, a German bomber crew got lost. Instead of hitting a military target, they accidentally dropped their bombs on central London. Churchill was furious. He ordered a retaliation raid on Berlin. Hitler was humiliated. He promised to wipe British cities off the map. Hermann Goering ordered the Luftwaffe to switch targets. Stop hitting the airfields, start hitting London. It was a tragedy for the civilians of London, but for the Spitfire, it was a miracle. The pressure on the airfields lifted, the runways were repaired, the exhausted pilots got sleep. When the massive German armada returned on September 15th, Battle of Britain Day, expecting a broken enemy, they met a fully reconstituted Royal Air Force. The Bf 109 had a weakness we haven't discussed: legs. It carried only 400 liters of fuel. It had no drop tanks in 1940. Its combat time over London was 10 minutes. 10 minutes! When the red light on the dashboard flickered, the German pilot had to turn home regardless of the fight. Spitfire pilots learned to wait, to stall, to drag out the fight. They watched the 109s turn back, leaving the bombers defenseless. And then the slaughter began.
Hitler indefinitely postponed the invasion of Britain. The Spitfire had held the line. But the war wasn't over. In fact, for the Spitfire, the darkest days were just beginning.
1941. The RAF went on the offensive, sweeping over France. Spitfire pilots were confident. They knew how to beat the 109. Then they saw a new shape in the sky. It had a radial engine. It looked short, stubby. It's just an old French plane, they thought, or maybe a generic transport. They were wrong, dead wrong. It was the Focke-Wulf 190, the Verger, the butcher bird. Designed by Kurt Tank, it was everything the Spitfire wasn't. Where the Spitfire was delicate, the FW-190 was rugged. You could land it on a dirt road. You could leave it in the snow. And in the air, it was a monster. The Spitfire Mk5, the current pride of the RAF, was suddenly obsolete. The FW-190 was 25 miles per hour faster. It climbed faster, but its roll rate was the killer. It could flick roll and change direction faster than a Spitfire pilot could even think. If a Spitfire tried to dive away, the 190 caught it. If a Spitfire tried to climb, the 190 caught it. The only thing a Spitfire could do was turn tight and pray. The losses were catastrophic. The Focke-Wulf scourge. For the first time, the British engineers panicked. They considered stopping Spitfire production entirely. Maybe it was time to scrap Mitchell's design and build something new. But they remembered Mitchell's genius. The wing, the airframe. It had room to grow. The answer was the Spitfire Mk9. It was supposed to be a stopgap, a temporary fix. They literally took a Mark V airframe and bolted on the new, massive Merlin 61 engine with a two-stage supercharger. It was a hot rod. When it arrived in July 1942, German pilots thought they were attacking the old, slow MKVs. They got a nasty surprise. The Mk9 restored the balance. It could climb with the 19, it could dive with the 19, and above 20,000 feet, it could leave the 19 gasping for air. The Duel was back on. From 1942 to 1945, it was an arms race of madness. Messerschmitt pushed the Bf 109 to its absolute limit, the Gustav model, then the K model, the Kurfürst. They added methanol water injection, MW50, to boost power. They added heavier cannons, but the airframe was too small. It became heavy, unstable. Taking off in a late-war 109 was like riding a unicycle on a tightrope. It killed novices before they even saw the enemy. The Spitfire, however, found a new heart. The Rolls-Royce Griffon, 37 liters, 2,050 horsepower. The Spitfire Mark 14 was a beast. It climbed vertically. It chased down V-1 flying bombs. It hunted jets. Mitchell's beautiful, elegant design had turned into a muscular brute, but it still flew like a dream. By 1945, the engineering duel was over. Not because one plane was strictly better, but because one nation had run out of time, fuel, and pilots. The factories that built the 109 were rubble. The fuel needed to test them was gone. The Spitfire reigned supreme, not just because of its design, but because the system behind it, the logistics, the radar, the training, had triumphed. We talk about horsepower. We talk about turn rates. We talk about millimeters of armor. It is easy to forget that inside these aluminum shells were men. Boys, really. Most were barely 20 years old.
They hadn't lived long enough to vote, but they were old enough to die at 30,000 feet. The psychological toll was crushing. In the Spitfire, you were deafened by the engine, frozen by the altitude, and constantly scanning for a silhouette that meant death. In the Bf 109, you were cramped, breathing pure oxygen, flying a machine that punished the slightest mistake, and they respected each other. There are countless stories of chivalry, of German pilots guiding damaged Spitfires back to the coast instead of finishing them off, of British pilots refusing to shoot at Germans hanging in parachutes. They were enemies, yes, but they were members of the same exclusive, terrifying club. They were the Knights of the Air. But make no mistake, it was a slaughterhouse. Over 3,000 Allied aircrew died in the Battle of Britain alone. The Luftwaffe lost over 4,000, and the machines they died in became their coffins.
Today, 80 years later, the duel continues in museums and air shows. When you see a Bf 109 today, it still looks dangerous. It looks predatory. The angular canopy, the narrow stance, the shark-like nose. It looks like a weapon designed by a villain in a movie. It commands respect, but it inspires fear. It is a reminder of German engineering prowess, yes, but also a reminder of the dark purpose it served. But the Spitfire evokes something else entirely. When a Spitfire flies over, people don't recoil, they cry. It is arguably the most beautiful machine ever built by human hands. The curves, the grace, the sound. It transcends warfare. It became a symbol of freedom, a symbol of the few standing against the many. Technically, the Bf 109 was the most produced fighter in history. Over 33,000 were built. The Spitfire, around 20,000. But numbers don't tell the story. The 109 was a sprinter that ran out of breath. By 1944, it was obsolete, pushed beyond its limits by desperate engineers. The Spitfire was a marathon runner. Mitchell's design was so perfect, so adaptable, that it remained a frontline fighter from the first day of the war to the very last. It was the only Allied fighter to be in continuous production throughout the entire conflict.
So, who won the engineering duel? If you want a plane to build cheaply and flood the skies, the Bf 109 wins. It was a masterpiece of logistics. If you want a plane to kill bombers and dive away, the 109 wins. It was a masterpiece of specialized violence. But if you want a plane to survive, if you want a plane that can turn inside a phone booth, a plane that forgives your mistakes, a plane that can evolve from a 1,000 horsepower cub to a 2,000 horsepower monster without losing its soul, then the Spitfire stands alone. Willie Messerschmitt built a sword, sharp, deadly, but brittle. Reginald Mitchell built a shield, strong, adaptable, and unbreakable. And in the end, the shield broke the sword. Today, these former enemies fly wingtip to wingtip at air shows. The hatred is gone. Only the engineering remains. Two masterpieces, two visions of flight. one shared history. Now I turn the question over to you. You are a pilot in 1940. You are walking across the wet grass at dawn. Two planes are waiting for you. One offers you the power to dictate the fight, the climb, the dive, the initiative. The other offers you the agility to survive the fight, the turn, the grace, the endurance. Which cockpit do you climb into? The Messerschmitt 109 or the Supermarine Spitfire? Let the debate begin in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next dogfight.